Hello, I am Sylvain Meret. On behalf of the ISMETA Board of Directors, I welcome you. I am honored to introduce Dr. Christine Caldwell, who is offering this session entitled Conscious Movement Sequencing.
Thank you, Sylvain. It's very good to see all of you. For me, it's 7 o'clock in the morning, so I'm still kind of opening my eyes to the day. And wherever you are in the world, again, I welcome you to this workshop. We have a luxurious almost 2.5 hours. And I'm really hoping that we can explore both the theory and the practice of understanding conscious movement sequencing. And just to say that this is one of the central themes in my work, but I think that conscious movement sequencing, you can see it in so many different disciplines and so many different somatic practices that I don't think the concept itself has it is so probably important, even if it's not spoken about out loud. It's so important that you see it in virtually all of our systems and practices. So I wanted to really look at, from several different lenses, what might be going on here and why this is so important from, again, several different perspectives. So let's go ahead and move forward. So this is, let me just say that I will work from a PowerPoint because I feel like there's some important theory work going on, but we will be doing experientials within talking about the idea. And please self-regulate in terms of these experientials. Just do what feels right in your body and go as far or not as far as you care to go. I'm going to trust that you know best. You know best about your experiencing. So let's go forward, because what I again really get interested in, as you can see from this slide, is a broad sense of inclusion about how we see our work and how we actually help our work to happen in the world. And one of the ways that I get really interested in talking about this is the idea of coherency. And so my sense is that by working with conscious movement practices, we go from a kind of emergent, wonderfully unstructured somatic experience to a kind of coherent experience that can be communicated, that can be understood, both by yourself and by others. So going forward again, I would like to say a few words about location. And so here in the States, we're increasingly becoming aware that us white folks who are here are what we call colonial settlers. In other words, we invaded and disrupted the experience of the people who were here first, the indigenous populations. And so it's become somewhat customary to begin a time together by acknowledging whose land we're on. And of course, that's a very complicated position here in the States, very tender position here in the States. And so I just wanted to do that as a way for us to, again, appreciate where we are in location. our very sense of location. So because we're on Zoom and not in a particular place, I'm just going to talk about my place. And perhaps you can take a moment to reflect on the land that you are on right now and however you experience that. And so for me, the people's land that I'm on is the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Apache, the Shoshone, the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Navajo. Colorado was walked over and lived on by many different tribes over the years. So also another sense of location is to say a little bit about or identify myself, identify my locations. And so I want to also say that I'm white, middle class, cisgender female. I'm older, I'm large, I'm bisexual, and I'm reasonably fit and able-bodied. And so that's, again, the locations that I come from. And a lot of times that's the viewpoints that that are easy for me to look through. And so we want to, again, appreciate how our locations create a panorama or a viewpoint on, let's say, our experience, the experience of others, and bodies in general. And so it's important that we actually identify our locations so that we can begin to reflect on how those locations both enable and obstruct different ways of looking at the world and ourselves. So another sense of my location is that I spent 40 years as an academic as well as a clinician. So I have a strong university-based background, and I am used to publishing and doing research and teaching on a graduate student level. And so that also, again, really shapes one of my locations. Also, from the very beginning of my career, even in my late teens and early 20s, I was studying at the same time both the field of body psychotherapy and the field of dance therapy. And so these two seemingly separate lineages, I always had one foot in one and one foot in the other. And as we go forward, you might see that. You might see the influence of me actually beginning my career, both really looking at the ideas and the theories and practices of both of those disciplines, and trying to reflect on the blind spots in both of them, and the strengths, the real powerful practices that both of them have. And also I'm a writer. I love writing, and so I have a bunch of articles and chapters and books, but one of the things I did want to say is if you go into the chat function, I've uploaded 2 of my articles for you. One is on conscious movement sequencing, and I think the other one is on what I call micro movements, because a lot of how I understand conscious movement sequencing comes from the idea that we're picking up little micro movements. We're in a sense, we could say micro movements are oftentimes only semi-conscious or even unconscious body practices that we are doing on an ongoing basis. We're always aware, when we're doing large movements, those are our real conscious, more privileged movements. But oftentimes micro movements can be very marginalized. They can be unacknowledged, not felt on a conscious level. And so a lot of times I work from looking for and supporting micro movements as a way to begin to work on that somatic level. And I'll go into that as we go forward. And also just to say, Sylvain will be monitoring the chat. If you have a question or a comment, please put it into the chat because there are a few places in the PowerPoint where I'm going to pause and just have us comment and reflect and sort of digest what we're working with. I'm also going to have several places in here where we're going to do some experiencing, self-experiencing. So again, as you go forward, if you have comments, please do put them in the chat. And then when we come to a pause point, we will play with those, play with your questions and comments. Also, we might take just a couple of minutes pause in the middle so that we can stretch and maybe drink some water, etc. Okay, so let's get going. So let's start out with a little bit of practice that just begins to focus our attention on, in a sense, what I would say is the kind of the value system of beginning to look at conscious movement sequencing. And so right now, if you could, whether you're standing, sitting, lounging, whatever you're doing, if you wouldn't mind just checking into your breathing. And so for the purposes of our work here, what I'd like to say is that just pay attention to your breathing the way it is. Try not to evaluate it or change it. Try not to imagine that it's supposed to be different. Just really paying attention to it the way it is. Just enjoying it the way it is. And again, working not to explain it or control it, but just participating with the nuance of your breathing. And now you can still hold that awareness of your breathing, but let's move to a focusing the kind of the beam of our attention on moving. And so for now, for these purposes, if you could, just noticing little small movements. And so you're welcome to move in larger ways, but it's also very useful to just notice the everyday ongoing little tiny things that are going on in terms of your breathing, that are going on in terms of just the business of being alive in your body. And so I would invite you to use your own sense of it to just notice the movement that's actually already there, already happening, little tiny movements. And if it feels right, you can also move more deliberately. And again, we try not to control the movement or make it different, but just cooperating with it the way it is. That the tiny little movements are just what's happening right now. We don't have to explain them or make sense of them. Notice the tiny little movements that sometimes are about maybe relieving something, like there might be some pressure somewhere and you move a little bit to relieve the pressure, or something might be a little tight and you stretch it. That's fine, but just notice that. Notice that you're moving as a small way to be different, to take care of something. And now you're welcome to stay with and still check in with your breathing and your moving. But now we'll add in another element, the element of sensing. And so now let's begin to just focus the beam of our attention on different sensations in the body. Again, not trying to analyze it or tell a story about what it means or critique it in some way, but just to notice different sensations. They can be very mundane. They can be very everyday. They can be very subtle, very dramatic. Just bring your attention to them very equitably so that you're listening to the small sensory voices as well as ones that might be more familiar or more dramatic. And now we're going to do a Zoom challenge. And that would be that if we were together, this would be very simple and easy. But we're together on Zoom a different way, a virtual way. So we want to add in the element of relating. And of course, this would be very straightforward if we were in the same room. But since we're in a Zoom room, let's just take a moment, and what I'd like you to do is to oscillate your attention between looking at some of the frames of other people who are here and just kind of acknowledging their presence, and bringing your attention back to yourself and just feeling your own experience, and then looking out again and looking at my face or Sylvain's or other people that are in the frames. But just take a minute to feel that sense of relating with your attention, that your attention goes out and it lands on someone. And again, we just work with the direct experience of that. We're not going to tell a story or explain anything or make sense of it, but we just land our attention on each other Notice your breathing and moving and your sensing as you do that. You can kind of bring your attention back in. And then you can bring your attention out and really kind of caress with your eyes the people that you can see. And again, just as an act, we don't evaluate or explain or critique. Okay, and let's just take a last minute in the experiential to play with going amongst breathing, moving, sensing, relating, and just sort of putting them all together. Okay, so I would encourage all of us to stay in contact with that experiential as we go forward. So one of the very central principles of my work is the idea of oscillation, that particularly we oscillate our attention. We bring it back and forth. So one of the big oscillations is in to out. Another is from panoramic attention to narrow attention. And so just being sort of playing with, as we go forward, this idea of oscillating your attention, that you can look at the PowerPoint, the me, the other people, look at the room that you're in, etc. And then you can oscillate your attention in and notice what's going on in you, and playing with what movement is actually already happening and consciously supporting movement that's already happening, rather than sort of thinking, oh, now I have to raise my arm because blah, blah, right? Just supporting movement that's already happening. Okay, so now let's go forward. There's going to be some terms that I'll use that I don't know if I could say that I coined these terms, because I think, usually terms just kind of make the rounds, and a good term is just used by all. So, but I wanted to really talk about what I mean by some of these terms that I'm going to be using. So one term I'm going to use is called body narratives. And this is an idea that I got from studying identity theory. I was actually forced at one point about 10 years ago to, at the last minute, teach a developmental psychology course in the counseling program. And so I had to research a lot of, developmental theory, and I landed on the issue of identity, because a lot of developmental theory is interested in how identity it develops. And so there's this relatively newer theory called narrative identity. And it's the idea that our identity is actually formed by the stories that we tell about ourselves, about who I am, and the stories that are told about us. And so identity is actually sort of stories that we live by. And so that's sort of classic identity, narrative identity theory. And I just thought that was very cool because we can change the stories, right? We inherit stories, they're passed on. Our parents have this, cute thing that they tell about something that happened when we were 4, and we live by that little story. So a lot of our stories are inherited. Some of them have happened to us within our lifetime, and we live by those stories, those events. But what was really missing for me in identity theory was the body, in the narrative identity theory particularly. And so my sense is that the body also holds and moves its own stories, that the body tells its own stories. In other words, sensing and moving and relating and breathing are a way of the body telling its own stories and telling stories about its past and about its present. And so there's a way in which we want to expand our sense of storytelling to include the nonverbal and to actually appreciate that oftentimes the body is telling stories that have been suppressed or marginalized or just ignored by our conscious narrations of stories about ourselves. And so my work really looks at the recovery and the support and the sequencing, the conscious sequencing of these narratives that emerge. So my field, the field that I'm in, is the psychotherapeutic field. And I've always been, though, a body psychotherapist, always, and a dance therapist. I never learned psychology separate from the body. Very lucky that way. So this idea of supporting this nonverbal storytelling is what I get very interested in. And what I feel is, there's a strong healing component to being able to support our body narratives. But I also think there's a strong learning component, that literally how we learn is also through these moving these stories, but also how we engage in creative or artistic processes are also part of this idea of body stories. And so I've actually, I work with, for instance, choreographers and dancers a lot to understand how to support body narratives to emerge in and be applied in artistic formats as well as psychotherapeutic formats. Okay, so that forms our sense of body identity. And so for me, a lot of the mistakes of what we might call identity theory, a lot of the mistakes that are made in identity theory are that we think identity is a cognitive phenomenon. We think it's a mind, it's what we think about ourselves. And this is a huge mistake, right? An obvious one for us. But our sense of self is a body self. Of course, this was actually said by Freud very, very clearly. He said that our ego is essentially a body ego. So again, we want to really appreciate that from the perspective of our somatic professions, that our sense of self is generated and maintained by these narratives, by these body narratives. And so I get interested in the body narratives that we sort of habitually do, that become kind of encased in habitual movement. By the way, habitual movement is great. We want movement habits, but how they can become just automatically retold and retold and retold in the body that is constrained by these movement identities. And so again, what we're going to do is to really look at identity from the perspective of the breathing, moving, sensing, relating body. Okay? The last concept that I think is really critical in my work and increasingly in most of our works is a sense of bodily authority, body authority. And this is our sense of empowerment and agency through how we breathe, move, sense, and relate. So the sense of the socio-political qualities of the embodiment are what get really interesting for me as well. The idea that one of the best ways to oppress someone is to make their body wrong, right? And we do that, of course, to ourselves. We do it to others. And one of the projects that I feel is so important that we can do with our work is to really help people to recover a sense of the authority of their own body, the integrity of their own body, the dignity of their own body, and the rights of their bodies. And so we can study this on a large format. Again, let's say the socio-political format of political issues of incarceration, the incarceration of bodies. We can look at it in terms of labor, how we do labor in our societies, who is working in the fields, who is working in factories, who is working at a computer, these kinds of things. So we want to have this kind of larger frame as well as a personal frame for this sense of the authority of my body to be able to know how I feel and what I want, and to be able to support how I feel and what I want, and to support that for others so that I'm not marginalizing some bodies and privileging other bodies. And that my actions have that kind of somatic equity issues going on. And so this for me is a very critical part of my work, that the idea that our work is also about the recovery of bodily authority when it has been lost or ignored or suppressed. And I'll talk about that as we go forward. But I wanted to, again, introduce these three terms so that we can really use them and play with them and understand them both from our own personal positioning and locations, but also from larger and larger locations, particularly socio-political. Okay, there's a lot going on here. So I want to say a few words about how I understand movement sequencing into body narratives. But let's just take a moment and kind of wiggle around and get a sense of how this topic is feeling for you, how your physicality is absorbing and working with some of these ideas as we go forward. So take a moment to just oscillate your attention in and just notice the impact. It might be very slight, but it might be dramatic. It might have woken up something for you that's dramatic. But just take a minute and to acknowledge as you oscillate in how you're doing with this ideas of particularly body authority, body narratives, identity. Yeah. So it might cause you to touch, it might cause you to move or breathe. And I really want to support you to keep playing with that, because that's your body really participating with and engaging with an idea, that there's this kind of, there's a lack of separation between ideas and actions. that ideas and actions are very intertwined. And so we can be with these ideas in an active way, right, with our body. Okay, so movement sequencing is in terms of how I'm going to play with it today, because I think we can understand it in a bunch of different ways, in a lot of our own ways. But in terms of how we want to play with it today, it's going to be a conscious process, an attentive process that you open up to and participate with emerging movement responses to both current states, what's happening right now, but also remembered states. There's a lot of ways, as a quick aside, I, for many years, taught neuroscience, clinical neuroscience in my graduate counseling program. So a lot of times I had this kind of nerdnik way of framing things that comes from my neuroscience background also. So just to say that, because if you're interested, I can go there with you a little bit. But backing into what I was about to say is that from the perspective of the body, there's not a whole lot of real hard distinction between current states and remembered states. And this is what makes a kind of an experiential therapy or a body-centered therapy or a body-centered practice so powerful, because you can work with current states and remembered states at the same time, because from the perspective of the body, they're not particularly different. So we're going to look at the idea that particularly in therapy situations, but also any situation that has a whole lot of integrity to it, that you're going to have one foot in the present moment and one foot in remembered moments or past moments. So the whole idea of remembering is that you remember in the current situation. You call up a memory within a current framework. And if you can establish the current framework, you sitting in the chair right here, right now, or you being with a therapist or you being with a teacher, that if that current framework is stable, relatively safe, compassionate, and attuned, that remembered states can really be dealt with, can really be handled in a very caring and challenging and supportive way. And so this is one thing that, again, gets very important, is that we can use conscious movement sequencing to work in this beautiful juxtaposition. Well, juxtaposition is not quite the right word, but this beautiful blend of current and remembered states. So movement sequences emerge somewhat spontaneously. They're probably not spontaneous. I'm not sure that spontaneous is a word that we could use for the body, because the body's always within a historical context of how it has been moving, how it has been structured. You're always moving from that frame, right? But we can say that certainly movement can be more spontaneous and less spontaneous, and more creative and more habitual, let's say. We could begin to play in that way, but just noticing that there's probably no real extremes there. It's a kind of this delicious continuum that movement sequences somewhat mysteriously still, to me, kind of bubble up. And this is what gets very interesting to me, is a lot of how things bubble up that we weren't planning on doing, that we weren't willing to do. And so in dance therapy, there's a classic founding mother named Mary Whitehouse, who talked about it in terms of the difference of moving and being moved by something. And so a lot of times we're just moving, we're being deliberate, and other times we're being moved. And a lot of what we want to study as we do our body-centered work is how both of those sources of movement are important. That there's this feeling that we can move our body deliberately, and that also we can be moved by each other, by life, by a movie that we go to, that, by an amazing dessert, or a real nice crusty piece of bread. I've been learning how to bake bread during COVID, and sort of the stereotype, right, of baking bread during COVID. And there's something about that crusty with the nice soft center thing that is really exciting for me in these days. So again, sometimes these movement sequences, they emerge very creatively as oftentimes as micro movements, real tiny little movement impulses. And they're not yet exposed to what in neuroscience we would say is your left hemisphere of your brain. They're not exposed to the part of you that is logical and linear and verbal, and puts things in sort of coherent logic sequences. And so a lot of what emerges from the body is this very kind of seemingly chaotic, but actually just very creative movement impulses that happen on a constant basis. And they're coming from, again, processes, experiences that you're having that might be unconscious, subconscious, or partly conscious, that you're also processing, not just on your conscious level. And so we want to really, again, sort of blur the distinctions between conscious and unconscious, and really invite a lot of what the body's doing that is playing around and creating a lot of, for instance, your sense of mood, your sense of energy level, and all these delicious things. And so a lot of what we're playing with is allowing these kind of unstructured, non-linear, seemingly chaotic experiences to begin to emerge, and not kind of pounce on them and try to make them understandable and explained or critiqued, right? We're just wanting them to kind of bubble up and be themselves and not need to make sense right away. That's, again, some of the essence of the work that I do. And so we want to allow movement sequence to begin in this kind of unstructured way, and that within them we are both moving and being moved at all times. And what we do is we actually give them very conscious, open attention. And attention creates a kind of holding environment that supports movement sequences to emerge. In other words, if I can hold my experience in my attention in a very open, non-judgmental, non-analytical way, and not trying, again, to make any kind of cognitive sense out of it, right? But just really allowing it to emerge under its own terms, using its own voice, its own nonverbal voice, and allowing it to be that kind of chaotic, more spontaneous, non-linear self. This kind of bubbling up is what I get interested in very strongly from my psychotherapy, particularly from my psychotherapy lens, but also from an artistic lens as well. And so it's non-judgmental, non-analytical. We don't explain it. And I have a tendency to call it postponing meaning making, to really just try to cooperate with something that's emerging rather than starting to either cognitively manipulate it or physically manipulate it. Okay, so these, what happens is when we hold that attention, that kind of really open attention, really allows these seemingly chaotic movement impulses to begin to talk. And that talking is a kind of self-organizing process. It's a self-organizing. So in other words, the body starts to actually make its own sense to itself. The body starts to go, oh yeah, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then, oh, this comes in, right? And so it begins to really say, okay, you're giving me attention, this is what I want to say, right? And so it begins to talk, and we're not putting it into verbal wording at this point. We're just allowing the kind of, okay, now it goes here, and then now it seems to want to go here, and now it goes there. And it plays through us and organizes through our holding of it in this very careful, attentive process. And that's why, again, I call it conscious, right? Because we're actually, it's, in many ways, it's a kind of contemplative practice, right? It's this conscious reflection or a conscious attention, because reflection, oftentimes the word involved sort of connotes thinking. And we're not interested in this sort of verbal thinking at this point. So, but I have been strongly influenced by different meditation traditions to understand this quality of attention. So again, these body narratives that begin to organize, they give us kind of a different perspective. In other words, a lot of times we've all had experiences of something happening to us that is different than what we thought. We have these ideas about the way the world works, about who we are, about who other people are. Sometimes in different psychotherapy traditions, these are called core beliefs or core organizers, kind of real fundamental beliefs about who you are and what the world is like. And so body narratives oftentimes tell different stories. Body narratives oftentimes tell stories that are very fundamental to our physical nature, and also hold early experiences, pre-verbal experiences. They also hold emotional experiences, non-verbal experiences. So they hold memory in their own creative way. And this is why we want to support them, because a lot of times our actual experience of ourselves in the world is so much more richer and complete than what we think, right? Than what we think we know. And so by supporting these different takes on the world, we expose ourselves to learning, to creativity, but also to healing, because we can really be moved by something that's different than what we think we know, or what we think we are like, or the world is like. And so our body narratives can be very different than our verbal narratives. As I said, they're a very crucial part of healing and learning. They really kind of get to a kind of essential self, which again is this body self. And they get to oftentimes more coherent and empowering narratives. If I can support my own body narratives, I return to a sense of the authority of my body, that sense of who I am matters. It literally is material. I am material. I am here. I am matter. And I matter. And other bodies matter. All bodies matter. And so there's this idea of the empowering narrative, and also the idea that supporting these movement impulses through our conscious practices to become movement sequences and body narratives, that can allow us to complete with them, that the story gets told, and there's something that allows us to let go when we've actually really told the story. And we see this oftentimes in trauma therapies, that just being able, it can be important to be able to verbally tell our stories in terms of trauma. It can be very powerful to tell our stories verbally. But what I get interested in is this idea of how we can reposition what is happening, what happened to us, so that it doesn't constrain our behavior and our thinking and our feeling going forward. It is still a memory. It's still there. It has still contributed to who I am. What happened to me still has contributed, but there's a kind of repositioning so that it's not forcing my behavior, my thoughts, my attitudes going forward. And so it's a kind of completion with experiences to do these narratives. And so body narratives for me are also a strong tool in social justice work. They really work, again, to a kind of radical inclusion, and starting inside one's own body, a kind of radical inclusion of states and movements that have been silenced, or I'll use the word sedimented in a few minutes. It comes from work of a philosopher that I'm very fond of. But also the idea of the docile body that particularly feminist theorists have talked about. But I'll go into that in a few minutes because it's pretty interesting. Okay, so that was very dense. Let's take a moment and oscillate your attention. I'm going to take a sip of tea. You might want to type a comment or question into the chat. We're going to go there soon. But just oscillate your attention in for a bit and see what your body wants to do. And you might want to take a look at a few other folks in the frame and say hello. Here we are together, being in this material together. Okay.
Christine, could we sometimes not have the share screen so we can really see each other?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely possible. I'd like to do it maybe, well, I don't. So here's my confession. I get a little insecure about stopping the sharing and then starting it again.
Understood.
In terms of my ability to do that. But I'll see if I can do it. Because I agree, I think it would be much nicer to be able to look at each other more. But let me see if there's a natural pause point about that. Okay, so I want to go a little bit into this socio-political area just for a minute and understand include some of the forces that are impelling us to not consciously sequence our movement. And we all understand the psychological level, that different traumas or neglect have happened to us on a personal level, but we also want to appreciate how much we are potentially being harmed by broader forces. And so we can see that in terms of consumerism, in terms of the idea that the body is a commodity, that it is being relegated to an object status. Sometimes some theorists will say body as project. So the idea that your body is something that you always have to improve or at least change so that it's more acceptable in terms of how it's being seen in the world. So that has to do with ability, that has to do with age, that has to do with gender, that has to do with ethnicity, and how the body appears can be very socially constructed and socially mediated. Certain features of the body are privileged while others are marginalized, and this creates a kind of consumer culture also, where the cosmetics industry, the plastic surgery industry, et cetera. But we want to really appreciate how often we are influenced by these kinds of social forces. And so these social forces that get really interested in, for instance, the symmetry of our body and the proportions of different parts of our body, the lightness or darkness of our skin, how young we are, and how wrinkles are a failure, or our gray hair is a failure, that kind of a thing. How fit we are, how sexually attractive we are, how thin or thick, how fashionable in terms of clothing is oftentimes a kind of a signal about class status, and how able-bodied we are, and of course how we give gender signals, that it's absolutely important in most cultures that we present gender signals so that people aren't confused. They want, a lot of times societies kind of force us into gender binaries. And so that's a way in which we can understand, again, how body narratives can be suppressed on all the way from the personal level to the family level to community level to the social level. And that we want to be able to work on all of those levels. And so here is a natural pause point. So I'm going to challenge myself here, and I'm going to stop share. And here I am. Okay, there's a lot in the chat room. So let's, I want to do two things here. One is to, again, encourage you to still oscillate your attention and really stay present and awake to breathing, moving, sensing, and relating as you are here with us. And I'd also like to hear maybe from Sylvain about what's in the chat room and what you all are playing with and want to talk about at this point.
So in the chat room, there was quite some discussion about the seeing each other. So now we are in this position. So I think that's solved. And so I didn't see any question really clearly, but Robert Littman said, fascinating, explains a lot about personal development via movement. And Joe said, my brain is glowing with these outlines and that lightens my shoulders. So I guess if anybody has some question, that would be the moment, the time for it.
Is it through the chat or can we ask questions through here?
Go ahead, I would say.
Yeah, I think so.
I just, when you talk about postponing meaning making, which I love, do you liken that to being childlike, or saying, if you would speak to somebody about postponing meaning making, would you say as if you were first encountering the world? Would you use that or not? It would be more referential to an adult.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of ways that we could use that lens. That is certainly one lens that I think is very legitimate for this understanding of postponing meaning making. Particularly, you see that in like infants and toddlers, where they're just directly experiencing, and they're going from one experience to the other, and the meaning is in the moving, right? The meaning is in the action. And it's interesting that you're saying that, because what I notice is that I don't use that analogy very often. And I want to think about that. I want to reflect on that. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually talk about it from the perspective of how we can experience it just right now, as a state that my current self has, and that I can support more, which is very much in the tradition of teaching meditation, right? In meditative traditions and meditative practices, they'll talk about wanting to, like in the meditation traditions that I've studied, there's this idea that you want to just be awake. And if a thought comes in, you just label the thought and go back to the awake state where you're not thinking, you're not processing it on that level. And so a lot of times I kind of either consciously or less consciously invoke a more of a meditation tradition lens for that, because I think, to your comment, it's very similar. It's a very similar way of understanding this kind of the data of direct experience before we have molded it and manipulated it into what we call coherent form. But to me, coherency begins in the body. And we've oftentimes abandoned the body as a source of coherency. We think all of our coherency comes in terms of what we think about our experience. And that's a fundamental mistake. It's a fundamental mistake. And we want to, again, support that kind of direct coherency of the body. So thank you for that. I really want to think about that more.
Well, it seems to me like then there's this element of awareness and watching, which a child would not necessarily have, because they're really vested in the moment and in doing. So that's an interesting distinction. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because there's, in a sense that, I have a 4-year-old grandson and we take care of him a lot. And so I've been so privileged to see this process once again. Had to have someone in my life who's emerging from that kind of processing. And I would say that's true. There's this really raw data of experience always emerging and happening, but it takes some time to develop this kind of observing self. What Dykman is one of the first people who wrote a book called The Observing Self. And that's something that I get really interested in particularly that the observing self is simply this kind of beam of attention rather than a thinking process, right? Rather than an analytical process. It's really fundamentally a beam of attention. Thank you. That's really cool. That was fun discussion. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, since we've got this frame, let's take a minute and just see a few of ourselves and each other. So just sort of beam your attention and you can move your little Zoom framey thing and see others, and just sort of look each other in the eye as much as possible from a Zoom perspective. Say hello with the look on our face and our hands, yeah. And see if any kind of particular gesture comes to you. It could be playful. Yeah, so you can pick up some play projects from others. You can put the movements into a different part of your body, but pick up the quality of the movement. Or you can just try and do that movement. And remember our breathing and sensing as we are moving and relating. Okay, let's see. So, thank you. And I'm gonna keep moving here and I'm gonna see if my share screen is still. Oh, see, this is what I was worried about, is that my.
Can Rafaela help you?
Yeah, I'm going to, oh. What are you seeing right now? Are you seeing my PowerPoint?
It's still
No.
up. Yeah.
Shoot, this is what I was afraid of, is I am incapable of.
So the green share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, I did that.
And then you kind of have to go behind this and see on your screen what you have.
Yeah, let's try it again. Okay, now I've got it. For some reason, when I initially do it, it's not on my share screen function.
Thank you so much for navigating that.
Yeah. Okay, let's see now. We were here. Good. So let's go on to our next slide. This is super dense and I don't want to go through all of it, but I will make this PowerPoint available to you. I'll try to post it, or maybe I can give it to you, Sylvain, and you can post it for me at the end.
Yeah.
Because I want to just briefly introduce the work of the philosopher Elizabeth Benke, because I'm currently just in love with her. And it was like this amazing miracle to discover her, because she was actually talking about things that I thought I was the only one talking about. It's always very great and humbling when you think you've invented something in your mind and then you find out someone else talked about it 20 years ago. So this is the constant process of an academic, and I really want to introduce her to you, hopefully in a just easygoing way, because philosophy is not typically a hugely accessible discipline. It's got very highly specialized terminology that gives me a headache, and I read philosophy a lot. It's amazing to me how many philosophers are actually really strongly interested in embodiment and the body and a philosophy of the body. And again, when I read them, it amazes me. I keep, reading the book and going, these people have to get up and move around a little bit more. They're so in their heads. Oh my God, they're talking about the body, and it's like, do you ever move? And so Elizabeth is one of those people I feel like that moves. You can sort of feel that she must move. And she's also, she studied with Judith Aston, who is one of our presenters and is also my teacher. So it was a very powerful thing for me to realize that we share a similar root teacher in Judith Aston. So she's, again, a philosopher. She is very interested in movement. She's one of the few people that's really strongly interested in movement. By the way, there's also a few others, particularly Maxine Sheets Johnson is also a philosopher that is interested in movement. But Benki comes from a tradition called phenomenology. And I just want to give you a quote from her. So she says, when I inhabit from within some gesture that I'm making, I experience not a thing called body, but an ongoing dynamic process of bodying. When I inhabit a gesture from within, in other words, when I consciously track or attend to a gesture, I am bodying. So a body isn't just a material thing. It's not just a noun to Benki, but it's a verb, right? I am bodying when I do this conscious movement, okay? Even an involuntary movement, like a reflex, let's say, even an involuntary movement can be inhabited from within as if it was an ongoing gesture I am making. Even a reflex, we can do that. We can inhabit a reflex from within as if it's an ongoing gesture I am making. When I do this, I'm not a spectator of the movement. Now here she gets philosophical. I'm a dilated locus of power and possibilities. That's a little bit of a philosophical jargon, but I am sort of the center of empowerment and possibility that embraces unexpected and often subtle spontaneities, as well as deliberate actions, embracing movements of undergoing as well as those of doing, embracing my entire kinesthetic life. And so, boy, it doesn't get any better than that in terms of how we can understand what we're doing. Benki coined a phrase that I want to suggest to us that we can use, that we can take on and use in our practices. She talks about what she calls ghost gestures, And these are, interestingly enough for me, little micro movements that are not necessarily visible, that they're an inner tendency toward movement that can persist in the body, even though the larger gesture is not being performed. So in other words, there's this just 2 centimeters of sinking in my chest, even though I'm not doing this big observable collapse in my chest. There's a tiny little 2 centimeter sinking in my chest. That would be for Benki a ghost gesture. And this is very interesting to her. So again, there's this, what she calls it, it's interesting, she says, an inner tendency toward movement, right? That can persist in the body. So ghost gestures are an example of what she also now calls body sedimentation. Isn't that a wonderful term? Isn't that the best way of talking about it? Sedimenting, that there are sediments inside of our body. It's how we could, another way we can talk about the presence of the past in our body, the presence of issues that we've inherited, kind of the intergenerational body, or the community body, the body that we share across time with others and across space with others. So that, again, that sense that these ghost gestures are these little micro movements that are not necessarily visible. They're an example of body sedimentation, of things that have settled into your body and become a sense of identity. It's like, this is who I am. This kind of depression, this ever so slight sinking that becomes a kind of background depression that I start to think of as who I am. I am depressed because I have this sedimented ghost gesture that pulls me into that kind of both habituated state, but also that inherited kind of quality. And so this sedimentation, which she calls the effective presence of the past. And they are persistent, but they're not necessarily permanent. In this sense, the body is occupied. It's occupied by trauma, by the past, by current social forces. The body is occupied. And this is where, for instance, when we look at like Native American theory here in the States, they talk about the whites coming as a colonial settler. They come to settle the land. They took the land and they settled it for themselves. But we can also see that they take your body and they settle your body. They civilize your body. Different Aboriginal populations, their bodies were colonized or settled by removing them to church schools and forbidding native languages, forbidding native practices, etc. So this is how we can understand that sedimentation, and also that the occupied body. We can understand that from, again, both the sort of singular perspective of our own personal experiences, but also social forces. And so we want to get through a couple other terms that she has coined that are just, I think, super useful to us. One is this idea that, again, the ghost gestures can become kind of trapped in the body, reenacted in the body, and they make it hard to feel sensations and inhabit micro movements and sensations and breath from within. You muscularly work against yourself. This is something we can again see in the work of many people, but for me, the work of Judith Aston is very beautiful in this regard, where we see that idea of how we work against ourselves. We become stiffer, movement becomes restricted because of this being occupied. And these are what Aston taught Benke as called a holding pattern, where movement is simultaneously kind of produced, but it's also held back. So the movement impulse is there, but it's also held back. And that's a holding pattern in the body. The body holds it. Now, for me, it can hold that both with a kind of hypertension, but also with a loss of tone. It can hold it with a kind of hypotone as well as hypertone. So the body is occupied not just in terms of muscle tension, but also in terms of muscle fatigue. Okay, so that occupation is in both of those areas. And so the movement in terms of, and that's more me than Benki, by the way, to talk about that hypotone and hypertone. But these holding patterns is where movement is both produced and arrested or held back. And there's an ongoing bracing that Benki calls inadvertent isometrics. Isn't that a great technical term? Inadvertent isometrics, right? So you know an isometric exercise is one in which you are efforting a lot, but you're not producing emotion. Like if you're just holding a weight, that's an isometric. And so it's in contrast to the word isotonic, which is moving, right? But an isometric is holding something. And so inadvertent isometrics is this nice fancy term, right, for tension patterns. But we understand the tension pattern differently now. We understand the tension pattern as this kind of occupied body, occupied by trauma, occupied by the past, occupied by social forces. Okay. And so they have multiple intersecting and mutually reinforcing origins. And a lot of times origins that we don't even track or realize or remember or know about. So knowing that past origin, though, doesn't release it, because their power lies in their being ongoingly enacted, right? Ongoingly reinforced by how we move in the present moment. We enact them, we reinforce them, we perpetuate them in the present moment as ghost gestures. So nor can they always be present echoes of past troubles. They're not necessarily always echoes of the past, right? They may be in what she says, all too appropriate response to current networks of power relations. In other words, current oppressive forces. And so we might currently be in situations that cause these inadvertent isometrics. I was doing a research project once where I was interviewing, I was doing it with Ray Johnson, who's also a very important member of this conference. Ray Johnson and I were both doing a research project where we were interviewing people from marginalized social categories and asking them about their bodily experiences. And I remember talking to this one trans man who was talking about what it was like just to get on the bus to go somewhere, and how he would walk down the aisle of the bus and he would watch for who was potentially hostile to him, who was neutral, and where he could safely sit and where not. And that kind of ongoing social pressure just to keep your body safe was what was such a powerful way for me to understand this in terms of this man's experience. And so, again, it could be ongoing in the present moment. And so they're also, again, not necessarily like individual psychological problems. And this is where you might want to watch the presentation of Sujin Ma, who I think was on Thursday, who works with a lot of marginalized populations in her work. And she's really understanding how taking a perspective as a counselor, as a therapist with folks that are experiencing homelessness, folks that are survivors of sex trafficking, et cetera, where people that are really on the margins of society, she's really realizing that it's not useful to take this kind of individual psychological diagnostic approach, like you are bipolar, you are schizophrenic, that's actually not a useful lens for most of the folks that she's working with. That because of the social forces that are at play with folks that are having these experiences and the way their bodily movements are ongoing, shaped in a particular social context. So what we want to do then, our way out, according to Benke, and should be no surprise to any of us, is that we want to find body practices that match. Okay, notice the word match, because, and she takes that directly from Judith Aston, who really pioneered a lot of this understanding of matching. And so to find bodily practices that match the holding pattern. So in other words, we don't want to, massage out the holding pattern. We don't want to try to do a different movement that makes it different. That's manipulating it. That's trying to control it. That's using the same sort of critical lens that didn't work and probably put the inadvertent isometrics in there in the first place, right? So we don't try to remove the holding pattern, we match it. And so I'll go into the detail of what that looks like in a few minutes. But we match the inadvertent isometric. We inhabit them as if, in other words, an inadvertent isometric is something that we are doing that we're not aware of. And so in my work, what I would say is you then do the same movement with the awareness, right? You do the same movement consciously. And so that 2 centimeters of collapse in my chest becomes 2 centimeters of deliberate, going down in my chest, and then seeing where that wants to go. And then, so instead of making it wrong, instead of making the inadvertent isometrics wrong and trying to get rid of it, doing the opposite or things like that, we actually cooperate with it consciously as if we're doing it deliberately. And by doing it deliberately, we gain a sense of empowerment. We are empowering ourselves to do it deliberately. And then from there, my work comes in talking about how that helps us to find a body narrative, a body story. This is the beginning of a story. This 2 centimeters of the chest going down is like saying, once upon a time, or long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? So the micro movement at the beginning, that inadvertent isometric, is the beginning of a body story. And so that 2 centimeters of going down, instead of doing it inadvertently, we do it advertently. We do it consciously. And we support it and say, you have a right to be here. 2 centimeters of going down, you have a right to be here. You have a story. You have authority. You have a place in the world. Your voice is important. Your voice is important. I support this voice. I allow this voice to occur. This is so powerful. And it's a version of being with it the way it is, right? To really allow it to be the way it is and allow its voice to emerge. Very powerful. Okay, so we inhabit them as if they were consciously and deliberately done on purpose so that we can shift them. By the way, at this point in the slide, it's me and Benke talking together. It's not just Benke. So just for those of you who might be a little bit nerdnik about existential phenomenology, I'm sure many of us are, right? That was sarcastic. Says that our body is not something that I have, but something that I am. So I am my body. That's existential phenomenology. One way I talk about it is that we are all and only body. And that my mind is just something that my body does. It's one thing that my body does. My body digests, it breathes, it metabolizes, and it also thinks. But it's my body. That's how I deal with the mind-body issue, which is very similar to existential phenomenology. So my body's not something I have, but something I am. But then Benki comes in and she says, well, wait a minute. I think my body is something that I do. Isn't that interesting? My body is something that I do. And so she's, again, really orienting toward this sense of movement, the sense of action, which is, again, my home base. That's where I live. That's my happy place. And so, but she also wants to recognize that my sense of who I am, my body, what my body is not alone. That my body is not something that just ends with my sort of physical individuality, that I also have a shared body across and with others. And it could be with a rock, with a tree, with an animal, with another human, but that there's this sense of shared embodiment. There's not a strong distinction between my body and the body of others, of the earth, etc. And this is where we can, again, also go in another direction of environmental justice, right? And so environmental empowerment and understanding movement, not just on our individual body level, but across bodies, because we also need to understand movement and inadvertent isometrics from a community standpoint, from a family standpoint, from a social standpoint, that whole cultures can have inadvertent isometrics, right? Whole cultures can have these holding patterns that they share and pass on and become part of their identity as a culture, as a community. And so you don't, Benki says, I don't do it alone. I am both networked to others now, but I'm also connected to others in the past. I'm connected to who came before me. I'm connected to my ancestors. So the socially situated body is a body woven of movement. And this is Benki. The socially situated body is a body woven by movement, articulated by movement, and sustained by movement. By inhabiting ghost gestures, we don't have to reproduce the past. We engage in what she calls action research that liberates us and creates an embodied ethics. I just think that's a wow statement. By the way, action research is a technical term in research circles that you can Google for yourself if you want. But an embodied ethics, isn't that a beautiful way to put it? So that's Benki. So that's a lot of the theory that supports this perspective of what we do. And so I'd like to go into an experiential now so that we can feel it in our bodies. So let's just take a little pause. I need to drink. And I want to say that here is a kind of a short recipe for how I work. And, you know, we can, sorry, my chair is being weird. We can work from the recipe, but in my work, which is called the moving cycle, we can refer to the recipe, a recipe, or we can creatively play around it and with it. So it's not like a Bible. It's very important that it not be like a Bible because the body's not like a Bible. So, although I guess that sort of denigrates the Bible, you know, not everyone thinks the Bible is literal truth, right? It's can be inspirational too. So the first process that we do in this conscious movement sequencing is we open up our attention. And so I'm going to ask you to do that in a minute. And the idea again there is to really, as much as possible, very, excuse me, very similar to meditation practices. Just try to not think about it or evaluate, but just be with a kind of open attention to your present moment experience. So there's no meaning making. If you notice yourself doing it, because it's very normal and natural to do that, just sort of notice that and go back to just this idea of inhabiting the sensation, the movement, the breath, the relating, inhabiting it consciously. And what I do is I call this an as-is practice. As much as possible, we just notice something as it is, as it is. Now, we know from physics and from other folks that the act of paying attention to something actually changes it, but that's okay. We'll go with that. But we want to, as much as possible, just be with the experience as it is and notice those little attempts to control the experience by thinking, oh, you know, my neck is tilted, I will untilt it, right? Or my shoulders are tight, I will stretch them, right? So try to avoid that experience where we try to alter what's happening. For these, there's other reasons to do that, right? We do want to do that. We do want to, you know, stretch. We do want to get massages. We do want to alter something. That's okay. But in terms of this particular practice, this is a companion practice that we have to get equally good at, and that we are usually not good at. And that's with, as much as possible, just hold it in your attention, not trying to change it, explain it, critique it, make meaning from it. And so we're just holding the experience, because what happens then is that this kind of thins out the border between your conscious and your unconscious attention. Okay? And what happens is that different associations will emerge. So they can be sounds, images, memories, feelings, words. They can be a lot of different things. If you are into neuroscience, we could say we become more right hemisphere dominant. And the right hemisphere doesn't have language, it doesn't have logic, and it doesn't have linearity. And so that's where emotions are processed, that's where body states are processed, etc. We want to get a little bit more right hemisphere dominant. And so what happens, and this is, it was actually pioneered by Freud. Freud talked about free association, right? He had this whole idea about free association, and it was verbal, of course. And so what he did was he said, okay, lie down on the couch and just start talking, right? Just start talking, and you're going to go blah, 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 blah. And sooner or later, just you relax and your defenses relax as you talk, and little things you say kind of bubble up that escape from your defenses, right? And he saw the act of lying down and the act of this free association would kind of thin this border between conscious and unconscious. We're going to do it in terms of what I call physical free association. And so, in other words, we're going to do it from a body perspective. And so you hold something in your attention, you just stay with it and hold it, almost like a meditation practice. But what happens is different associations come up, and I'll give you an example in a minute. And these are the impetus or the inspiration for different movement impulses to also arise. And so I'll start with an example. So let's say I check in and I notice a kind of heaviness in my chest. I'll stay with this idea. And I notice a heaviness in my chest. And instead of trying to change it, okay, instead of trying to explain it, I just stay with it. And so I hold that in my attention, very similar, by the way, to focusing, right? Focusing from Eugene Gendlin. This is very similar here. So instead of trying to change it, I just hold it in my attention. And when I hold it in my attention, I notice that again, my chest does want to go down a little bit. And so a movement association starts to occur for me. Or it could be that I'll hold this in my attention and all of a sudden I'll just see the color blue. Or I'll hold it in my attention and a memory of wrestling on the floor with my brother when I was 5 and he put his knee on my chest and I couldn't breathe. Okay. So a memory might come up. Or I might hold this sensation in my attention and a feeling comes up. So a feeling of anger or sadness. And so these are all associations. And if we just hold that state, not try to manipulate it or explain it, just hold that state in our attention, it allows that kind of thinning to occur that allows these different associations to bubble up, physical associations. And so this is why I call it physical free association. And so that's what we want to do. Then we want to kind of braid in the associations. So now I'm getting a feeling of sadness and a feeling of going down. And so now I just hold on to what's emerged, which is the sadness and the going down. As much as possible, I just allow the sadness, I allow the going down, and then a movement sequence begins to emerge. And there it goes, and there it goes. And I'm making this up now, but it starts to sequence and go somewhere. And it becomes very powerful in terms of it starts to tell its own story. And I'm not going to put it into German or French or English or anything, right? I'm just going to let the body language be there. And so we want to do these consciously. We want to just participate with it consciously, deliberately, so that the movement sequence emerges. You support the sequence to gradually just go where it wants to go. It's actually very simple on that level. So just trust where it goes. And something might show up that surprises you. So there's this feeling that goes down, but then all of a sudden my head wants to pop up and my mouth wants to open and my right shoulder wants to go down, and then it all just kind of unfolds on its own. So I'm being moved as well as moving. I'm doing both at the same time. And so I'm staying with my breath. I'm really aware of the sensations in my body. I'm relating to myself. Possibly I'm relating to a friend or a teacher or a therapist also. I'm feeling the emotional impulses, because emotions are a kind of action. Emotion means move out, right? And so we keep seeing these all as resources for the body to begin to tell this story, and then the body tells the story and it keeps telling the story. And then I say, okay, I might just say that's enough for now, or I could feel that my body just wants to pause there. That's enough for now. And we're going to only do it for a couple of minutes. And then I can come up and say, oh, so I started here, I went here, and then sadness came. And then that memory with my brother, and then there was this thing and I felt kind of breathless. And so you can reflect on the action. You can reflect on the story. You can actually bring it into the left hemisphere and think about it. But you can also just be with it non-verbally. And so that's what we're going to play with right now. And so again, I want to encourage you to self-regulate with this. We can start just with paying attention to the body, but in other contexts, we can also start by choosing a theme. So let's say I have a theme of I am afraid of my boss at work. Every time I get around him at work, I start to feel frightened. And so we can actually take a theme and hold that theme in our attention and notice how our body responds to that theme. This is very similar again to something like focusing or Hakomi. Again, things that work, you'll see them in lots of different people's works, right? Lots of disciplines. So again, we can start with the theme or we can just start with the body. And so I would encourage us to start with the body, and also make sure that you just touch into something. If you touch into something that will pull you deeper or into more intensity, I would say just sort of touch it and then relax away from it, because this isn't the place to process something that could end up being like a very strong experience. And I wouldn't recommend doing that without somebody there with you anyway. So let's play with this now. So find a position that feels right to you. I would actually, typically, I don't encourage you to lie down, because that creates such a different relationship to gravity, but use your own judgment. Okay, so let's begin. Take a moment to just check in with your external environment. Also your internal environment. And just begin to pay attention, similarly to how we were working before, where we just paid attention to our breathing. Just paid attention to how the breathing is moving us, and how there might be other movements happening, your heartbeat, etc. And begin to pay attention to different sensations. Make sure to attend to different parts of your body, not just ones that are sort of strongly calling your attention, but little nooks and crannies of your body that you might not usually pay attention to, like the inside of your elbow or behind your right ear. And just stay with this breathing, moving, and sensing. Noticing moments where you might go into thinking about it, and just noticing that and very gently bringing your attention back to the details of your present experience. Just the little nuances of your present experience. It could be that you're looking at something. It doesn't have to be internal attention. It could be that you want to gaze out the window. And just hold that in your attention. Just notice. Try not to make it any different than the way it is. And as you pay attention, just notice if any associations come in. Any movements tend to emerge, or sounds, images that come up, feeling states that come up. And if you notice that, just bring that into your attention. It might be that you feel like nothing's happening, but nothing is the association. So just braid in that sense of, oh, the word nothing comes up. And whatever you notice, just hold that. And then whatever happens next, just hold that in your attention. And begin to notice what your body wants to do with this. What does my body want to do with what I'm aware of? And just begin to cooperate with that doing. Do it deliberately. Do it on purpose. Just the way it is. Not trying to magnify it or change it, but just try to do it the way it is. And don't worry if it's the right thing or the wrong thing don't worry about what you're choosing or being deliberate about. Just kind of follow it and see where your body wants to go. Notice if as your body starts to move, that new associations might come up, memories, sounds, images, feelings. Just follow what your body wants to do next. Trust what your body wants to do next. Just keep adding in what you notice, what comes into your attention. Just add it in and do it deliberately. Just as it is. You're breathing just as it is. And take another minute or two just to see where it wants to go. Take another minute. Just keep following what your body wants to do next, and take another minute to just find how your body wants to complete with this experience for now. And find any kind of breath or moving or sensing that helps you feel complete for now. And then bringing your attention back to the Zoom platform. And let's take a moment to see if there's anything you want to say about that experience, questions or comments you have about that experience. And I think there's not too many of us. There's just about 25 of us in this call. And so if you want to just unmute yourself, please feel free. We can probably tolerate a little bit of that talking, the possibility that you might unmute at the same time or something.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have a question, observation. When you work with people that, or with persons that have a lot of experience with movement, what kind of prompt or dialogue could you have to kind of gear them away from being, I guess, I don't know, hyperactive with the movement potential?
Yeah, this is such a cool question because in a sense, working with movers, it can be actually problematic in this way because you become sedimented by your own practices, right? Your own training. One of the most challenging things I do is work with dancers. It's so hard for them to exit that kind of aesthetic, the aesthetic of dance, and so anger becomes this, and yeah. So we become so sedimented as movers, professional movers. And this is such a great way to think about it. So there's advantages and disadvantages to working with movement neophytes and people who are really into it. So yes, you actually have to really work differently. And a lot of times what I'll do with people who are trained movers in one way or another is I'll actually ask them to inhibit movement impulses, inhibit like the first one, the second one, the third one, and wait for a movement to kind of surprise you. Because there's so much automaticity in movement, particularly again when you've had some kind of discipline about it. And so I'll oftentimes ask them to hold it back, and that the act of holding it back is itself a kind of movement, and that you can find a more interesting, let's say, movement from holding back what you were inclined to do or what you just sort of automatically fall into. Now, the other thing that we also tend to automatically fall into is relieving things. And so like there's tension and we just try and think that that's wrong and relieve it. And of course, we do want to relieve tension, and that's fine. But in this context, you don't relieve the tension. You actually investigate the tension. You actually go into the tension. You actually inhabit the tension from within. Yeah, really great comment. Thank you. Someone else wanted to speak?
I wasn't going to say much more than that's come up on the chat. I've been doing this work for this. I've been doing somatics and teaching for 40 years, and it doesn't matter how often I had the deepest experience, and it just brought such old things up. And I so want to thank you. It was that idea of not just releasing, which is, what I seem to do is so powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's oftentimes it takes a little work to actually experience what you just experienced. Some people are, pretty, they need time and attention to open this particular doorway.
I had a beautiful experience, if I could share, that I've had a pain in the back of my neck for several months that is very unusual for me. But I realized, I lost my mother this past year and my heart has been heavy. So then I've been having to hold my head up.
Wow.
And when I lifted my heart, the pain went away if I lift my heart, but it doesn't want to stay up.
Right.
And I've been trying to fix my neck. So when I did this practice, I allowed it, and we were very close, and it was a beautiful departure. So I don't have anything but loving anguish. My impulse was to whimper, and I made a puppy noise.
Yeah.
And when I gave it permission, it began to turn into a beautiful song.
Oh, yeah.
And it became a song of our bond, and I wanted it to fly to her, wherever she is. And it was really, it was beautiful experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because what I get so in love with or so fascinated by is that these places that we go, when we follow these impulses and do these sequences deliberately, are so powerful and so meaningful and true on some kind of just bare physical level that we couldn't get to before. That there is a kind of just raw beauty to them that I constantly fall in love with. When I do this work, what shows up, even though it might technically look weird or strange or odd, is so intensely beautiful, because what you're seeing is that body story that really wanted that song, right, that you found, that just emerged from going with it, going and trusting it and trusting your neck. So thank you so much for that example of that. It's a beautiful example of the beauty of conscious movement sequencing, that it's hard not to fall in love with these surprising things that show up.
Christine, I was struck by the concept of blurring the lines between conscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
And that alone seems to me to bring you to a place where I'm not trying to do anything, but the movement and whatever is wanting to emerge just shows up if I can hold my attention open.
Yeah.
The whole concept of releasing and all that just sort of disappears.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, the as-is quality is so powerful.
Yeah, I like the term being with or breathing with those blurring lines, and that seems to keep me present to the experience of what's moving.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me as well. Okay, I notice we have about 15 minutes left, but someone is raising their hand. Would you like to speak?
Yes, I am really impressed how quick it is possible to go in the depth or to connect to something what is important, and it feels so
Yeah.
easy in a way.
Mhm.
And it is good to follow this what I'm sensing, and I'm really impressed about it. And thank you for that this is possible in front of the screen. I'm really fascinated that it is possible to have this experience.
Yeah.
And I'm doing a lot of authentic movement, and it is similar in a way.
Yeah.
This is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Genau. Genau.
Genau.
I teach in Germany a lot, so.
Yes. Aha.
Yeah.
In Hamburg, I know.
Yes, Hamburg, Berlin, and Heidelberg.
Yes. Okay.
Mostly, and Basel soon.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, thank you so much for that. And I'm continuously appreciating how much when there's a principle that's so powerful and so simple, you'll tend to see it echoed in its own way in lots of different types of work. So you can see the presence of authentic movement. You can see the presence of body-mind centering or Aston patterning or focusing or these other elements that really support what I'm told is a phenomenological approach. And this kind of open attention, I get so fascinated with the bodily basis of attention, that attention is a resource for the body and is a powerful thing that we want to cultivate. I oftentimes tell my students that they have to become attentional athletes, that there's a kind of muscularity, a fitness to attention that I think is very central to body-centered work. That both you and Robert, I think, just talked about.
Christine, would you also say awareness athletes, or you would keep with attention?
Yeah, I typically keep with attention, but in my work, I call the first phase of a session the awareness phase. And so I also use this word awareness because, in a sense, part of what the process involves is becoming aware of that. When you pay attention in this way, you become aware of things that you weren't attending to before. And so the contents of awareness start to shift or expand. And that's what we want to see in any kind of creative or healing or educational process. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so I noticed that we have about only 10 minutes left. And so what I want to do is just sort of move through these last slides just to tell you that they're there and talk about, again, here on this slide, for instance, I want to just show you that there are some other terms we can think about over time about how we can interfere with this very natural process. So that's this slide. Our next slide is something I go into in great detail in my work, but I want to talk about how we see movement, and I see movement along various continuums, from immobility to kind of being stereotyped to being spontaneous, and to talk about how we can actually position our work within an understanding of how movement operates, almost on a biological level, almost on the level of physics. And to realize that immobility and stereotypy are not wrong. They're just another way that we move. And so we want to occupy this kind of gradient in our work in a very sensitive way. So again, I can't go into that further. This is just another way of talking about the experiential that we just did. And so you can see here, for instance, that word awareness is kind of the first thing, and I'm pairing it with the systems of the body. So I really feel there's this strong, very beautiful, delicious connection between the biology of the body and the psychology of the body. And so I'm always kind of wanting to have that be sort of a permeable quality to it. Not from a sense of, you know, the immune system means this or the nervous system means that, but that just cooperating with the nature of the different parts of the body. And so in my work, what I talk about is these kind of 4 phases: awareness, associations that we worked with. I call that the owning phase. Oftentimes we take ownership of something that arises. We say, oh, this is me too. That the back of my neck, that tension, let's say, is me too. So I take ownership of things I wasn't before. And also then that I appreciate them. I actually form a kind of caring relationship to that, what comes up. And action, that I can take it out of the session and apply it into my daily life, into the world. And that's when I, go into sort of the details and the practicalities of how to do the work. That's how I divide it up into the 4. And so this is just, again, I call my work the moving cycle. And that's how, again, we see this kind of progress of supporting the conscious movement sequencing. I call this bodyfulness. That's my latest book. It's called Bodyfulness, but it is based on this kind of triangle that we were talking about. That this is how you stay workable in the session when even very intense experiences can come up, and those intensities, you're not used to supporting them or doing them deliberately, and so you have a tendency to dissociate from them or exit them. So working with this, balancing the triangle of breathing, moving in ways that support your breathing, breathing in ways that support your moving, and staying awake in your body. And of course, I would add relating to that also. And so I had another experiential. You can try it yourself if you want on your own time. And so you can experiment with imbalancing the triangle and see what happens, what feels familiar. So you can move and hold your breath while you move. Or you can breathe and try to be real still while you breathe and notice the quality of imbalance or the quality of how it might dissociate you from things. And so we have to work not only with associations, but also dissociations. That's particularly an area of responsibility that we want to look at that I didn't have time to get to. This is a kind of inclusivity that I want to stress over and over, that we want to be able to support all manifestations of body, all manifestations of movement, of breathing, of sensing, and have that kind of a inclusive approach rather than seeing practices like movement practices or sensory practices that privilege or marginalize certain kinds of bodies or certain kinds of moving, certain kinds of sensing, certain kinds of breathing. And so we invite that as is. You show up, your breath shows up as is and is worked with as is. Your movement shows up and is worked with as is. These are some of my references. You can research, and there we go. And now, again, I will make this PowerPoint available to you, and I'll stop share so that we can spend our last few moments just looking at each other and being together, and just see if there's any other comments or questions that come up for you as we come to our last few minutes.
Can I have a question?
Yes. Could you turn up your volume a little bit? It's hard to hear you.
I just speak closer. Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay, so just now when we experienced, and then I started with one body part, I found the tension there. And then when the movement arrived, I felt the struggle, like I'm fighting myself between moving to the next body part, or I just keep focusing on the same body part. So, what will you say about this?
Yes, this is a really good practical question. And so sometimes that's actually a very common and normal thing that happens is you'll feel almost like these pathways. I could go here or I could go here. And usually, sometimes one pathway has more heart to it. And one pathway has more kind of going to sleep associated with it, and one has more awakefulness associated with it. But the only way that you can find out is to experiment. And so just choose a pathway. And if it kind of stalls out or puts you to sleep, no problem. It's not an issue, not a problem. You can just find your way back to another pathway. It doesn't even have to be the original other pathway. You can just say, oh, this feels like I'm not there right now. So go back to breathing, moving, sensing. Go back to just holding your experience, and you get back to square one, and then you go from there. And so there's no wrong choices. You just keep experimenting. Over time, as you do the practice, you can sense, you can get a feeling for which paths are scarier, which paths are more powerful and intense. You can choose them or not as the situation supports. And so it's all good. It's all good. You don't have to worry that one is a good idea and one's not. Even if one stalls out, that's important information. It's important information. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're right at our time. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything as we close?
Yeah, Christine, I'm sorry to put my voice in again, but I got very excited about something when you were talking about the inadvertent isometrics.
Yeah.
So as a breathing teacher and working with people right now, there seems to be an isometric phenomenon that's happening that people are afraid to breathe because of what's in the air.
Oh, yeah.
And that the body is wanting to take a full breath.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that's a really critical, and that was what my talk was about. It was really this critical issue of what are we going to do? And, it's time for action in some way.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Robert. It gives me a little bit of a chill, because the way I've noticed it also is that having to wear a mask, some of the masks that protect me in terms of going indoors also inhibit my breathing so badly that by the time I leave the inside space, I'm gasping for air. And so it puts me in this place where I feel a sort of small sense of emergency every time I'm indoors, because I'm not breathing well because of the mask.
I think the mask is a symbol too. It's a symbol. So as soon as we even get close to the mask or put it on, we're already thrown into the symbol of what it represents.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I think that our processing this pandemic is going to be something we'll need to do for years. And the somatic practices are going to be so important for this. The breathing practices. Thank you, Robert.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Anything to say, Sylvain, about being the host? Other than I want to thank you so much for being there.
So thank you, Christine, and thank you all for being here. We invite you, as with all sessions, to visit the discussion board associated with this session to continue the conversation. You will find the discussion boards back in with a session description, and I believe we will have your PowerPoint there. So we will, and the 2 articles and anything you want to post.
Okay, great. Well, I did already post the articles in the chat area. So should I repost them again, Sylvain? Or should I give them to you?
I reposted them already in there.
Perfect. Perfect.